I am really pleased to introduce this evening's guest presenter, August Jackson. August works as the interpretation coordinator at Mount Pisgah Arboretum in Eugene, and he's been studying and photographing bees and other pollinating insects in the region for over 6 years. He's authored a comprehensive guide to the bees of the Willamette Valley and is an instructor with the Oregon Bee Atlas. So thanks for being here, August. I'm really excited to see what you have to say, and I will go ahead and hand the reins over to you here in 1 second.
All right. Thank you, Chandra. I'm excited to be here, and thank you for giving the introduction as well, because that means I don't have to introduce myself, which is one of the things that I hate doing. So once I've got the screen share up, we'll kind of just jump right in. I'll say a couple more quick things. One of the things that I like to let folks know before we get into it is that I am not trained in entomology, so this was an interest that I got into after starting work at Mount Pisgah Arboretum. And one of the things that I really find kind of neat about entomology is that you can have outsiders making large contributions, and particularly in the realms of taxonomy and just kind of field observations, field biology, recording behaviors, because there's so much that is still not known about our bees, and there's just tons to learn. So what we're going to do tonight is just kind of go through a whirlwind tour of some of Oregon's bee diversity, and of course we could not, we're just going to barely scratch the surface of the diversity here that we have in Oregon. We'll talk about at the end, ways that you can learn more and you can help out if you're interested. But without further ado, I think we'll just jump right in. So in Oregon, there are over 500 species of bees. The exact number is not currently known yet. Could be as high as 800, could be exceeding 800. There's a project, the Oregon Bee Atlas out of Oregon State University that I work with, that is currently looking at cataloging the number of bee species in Oregon using citizen science. And this is kind of a really novel project, really the first in the nation, and it's already spawning offshoots in some other states across the country. So it's a really neat project that I'm thrilled to be involved with. We have over 4,000 species of bees in North America, likely. Some of that is still a little confused because, again, we don't know the taxonomy of the bees very well. And a lot of the names of bees that were described 150 years ago or so are still being sort of reconciled. So there are some bees that have been named twice or have been only identified from a male specimen, and it turns out that that species has already been named from the female that was found, 50 years later or so. So we don't really know how many species of bees there are in North America, but about 4,000, maybe more. There are over 20,000 species worldwide. And if we compare that to birds, which was kind of my initial interest as a kid growing up, we think there may be close to 10,000 species of birds across the world. So bees are pretty speciose, but not nearly as speciose as some of the other insect groups. And we're actually going to talk about those really quickly. So before we talk about bees, we really need to talk about wasps. So there's an enormous diversity in wasps. In fact, more and more researchers are beginning to think that there are more wasps in the world than any other group of animal. It's kind of, for a long time, folks were thinking that beetles were the most speciose. But now there's a tendency towards thinking that wasps might actually surpass beetles. And the reason for that is that there's so many tiny wasps that are parasitic on just about every other insect that's out there. So wasps are predominantly predatory or parasitic, except for the bees. And the bees are a wasp that evolved to be predominantly vegetarian. There are a couple species that still do consume carrion, but bees are predominantly vegetarian. One really interesting shared behavior among all of the wasps, including the bees, is this mass provisioning of their young. So when they lay an egg, they are setting up their young with all the food that they need to develop into a healthy adult. And that's, relatively uncommon in among insects, and that is shared among bees, and that's the reason bees are such efficient and effective pollinators. But we'll quickly look at a couple wasps, because I think people have this idea of wasps as being something kind of scary, mean. In reality, the vast majority of wasps are about as small as this one here. This is Andricus quercus californicus, and this is a minuscule, about 2 to 3 millimeter wasp. And this is the wasp species that creates the oak galls. So if you're in Western Oregon and you see these large apple-like galls from oak branches, this is a species that creates it. And it's photographed here sitting on an oak leaf bud. If you look really closely at her abdomen, you can actually see through it to see that her abdomen is full of eggs that she's ready to lay. So she mass provisions her young by laying an egg that somehow, and it's still not known, stimulates the oak to create essentially a cancerous growth, a tumor that provides both a home and nutrients to the developing wasp larvae. And studies have kind of looked at the contents of the oak galls that are created and found that the insides of them are more consistent with acorn tissue than with branch tissue. So they're almost forcing them to create this separate acorn to feed the developing young. And then on the other opposite end of the size spectrum, we have this tarantula hawk wasp, Pepsis thisbe, and this is not found in Oregon, but it's just an incredible example. So this I saw in southern Arizona outside of Phoenix, and these are about 2 inches long, so kind of thumb-sized wasps. And when they're flying around, they look and sound as loud as a hummingbird, maybe even a little louder. So they're pretty intimidating. And while the adults predominantly just kind of feed on nectar and other things as they're flying around, they mass provision their young with tarantulas. So they actually hunt tarantulas and bring them back to the nest, paralyzed and alive, for their young to feed on. So pretty big kind of gap between the life histories of those two species. So wasps evolved from bees somewhere in the area of about 100 million years ago. It's not quite clear yet. It might be pushing back pretty far, but the first angiosperms, or flowering plants, appeared about 125 million years ago, and we know that bees evolved after that, and a little bit after that. We have a good idea now of what group of wasps bees evolved from, and it's a lineage of thrips hunting wasps. So thrips are these tiny, tiny little insects that tend to feed in flowers on flower parts, so they'll feed on pollen. And the idea here is that the first bees were wasps that hunted thrips. So they'd bring the thrips back to the nest and they'd be coated in flower pollen. And over time, that pollen became more of the meal for the young. As they fed on it, they got used to it. And so eventually, those proto bees just started collecting and bringing pollen back to the nest. And in that process, there were small but really impactful changes in morphology, which I'll show in just a moment. And the other thing to note is that bees are really unique in their reliance on floral resources. So we have a lot of pollinating animals: hummingbirds, bats, flies, beetles, butterflies, moths, but almost none of those rely on floral resources for their entire life cycle. They'll feed as adults, but not as developing young necessarily. So bees are the one group consistently that is reliant on floral resources, except I'll show an interesting wasp exception to that in just a moment. So first, to the changes in morphology, and it's really similar to the changes from dinosaurs to birds, and it's all having to do with feathers. So bees evolved feathered hairs, which allowed them to better collect and carry pollen back. And these hairs actually often carry an electrostatic charge that holds the pollen in even better. So I think there's an interesting comparison there between bees and birds, in that both the transition from dinosaurs or from wasps evolved involved the evolution of feathers. And now to the exception to the rule of floral resources. This is a pseudomyceris wasp, and we have these in Oregon. We have several species in Oregon, and these are wasps in a quite different lineage, quite different section of evolutionary tree that have evolved in convergent evolution to utilize floral resources like bees. But as you can see from this photo, they're almost entirely hairless, and the reason for that is that they carry pollen internally in a crop. So they don't have the hairs of bees, but their behavior, their lifestyles are very similar to bees. So they're almost a cousin to bees, despite not being that closely related. So all of that makes bees really remarkable pollen vectors. Those hairs, the fact that they rely on floral resources for their entire lives, and the evolution of bees really coincided with the adaptive radiation of flowering plants. So about the time you see bees arriving on the scene, you see a huge explosion in the diversity of flowering plants until we get to the point where we are at today, where you have some families of flowering plants alone consisting of 20 to 30,000 species. And all of that really kind of happened in terms of evolutionary timescales very rapidly once bees arrived on the scene. So now we're just gonna kind of jump into bee diversity, and we'll take a quick look. So there's an extraordinary diversity, and right here, just to show the size diversity, we have one of our bumblebees, Bombus rufocinctus, and underneath it, we have a masked bee in the genus Halictus. And neither of these is the largest or the smallest of the bees that we have in Oregon, but you can see there's this extraordinary size difference. So that's partly because they're going to be visiting different flowers, their nesting habits are going to be different, and their sociality is going to be different. So we have large variations in sociality and floral specialization, whether a certain species of bee is reliant on either one species or a genus or a few closely related genera of flowers, diversity in nesting habits, where and how they nest, even in substrate specialization. So we have some bees that will only nest in sand dunes, some bees that will only nest in sandstone cliffs. And then you have territoriality, parasitism, and you even have some really interesting diversity in relationships with commensal mites. So not all mites that you see on the back of bees are bad. In fact, some bees, particularly bees in the genus Lasioglossum, some of the sweat bees, have evolved areas on their body that are specifically built to carry mites from their natal nest to the nest that they're founding. And those mites travel on them and they feed on fungi in the nest. So they help control the fungal populations, which allows essentially for the survival of the developing bee larvae. So it's not overtaken by fungal growth. So we'll jump right in, and we're going to start with bumblebees. This is our really common social species, or social group, I should say. And just as a point of reference, I have the species name, or at least the genus name, generally at the top of the page, and then down at the bottom of the page is the family to which the bee belongs. So there are 7 bee families in the world. 6 of them can be found in Oregon. The 7th is only found in Australia. And we're going to go through and take a look at some of the bees in 5 of the 6 families that we have in Oregon. So this is Bombus appositus. It's known by the common name white-shouldered bumblebee, and it's a reasonably common to uncommon bumblebee species that we find across Oregon, both in the Willamette Valley and in some of the higher mountain meadows and even into the Great Basin. So it's fairly widespread. Bumblebees are really our predominant social species. They're not social in the sense that honeybees are. Honeybees are actually colonial, where they'll set up perennial hives. So these are hives that can exist, almost indefinitely, as long as the health of the colony persists. But bumblebees only set up hives that last 1 year, and really they last for several months out of the year. And then new queens find a place to hibernate through the winter, and then the following spring and summer, they go and found their own nests. So a bit of a difference there from honeybees. They also don't produce a lot of honey because they're not working to sustain a hive or a colony through the winter months. So they're really just looking to pump out new reproductives. So we tend to see some of the earliest queens coming out in February and March. On some really warm years, you might see a queen in January. And they'll go out and forage and find a nest. And then you'll see the first workers come out. And the first workers are usually quite small because they're only feeding on what that one queen can forage. Then they go out and forage, the workers get bigger, and then they start producing males and new queens. And that's sort of the life cycle. Generally lasts 3 to 4 to, maybe max kind of 6 months. But we'll see bumblebees usually through September, sometimes into October. The other really fascinating thing about bumblebees is their intelligence. So a number of studies have shown that they have quite a degree of intelligence, and I recommend you look into one that was done within the last 3 years or so in Britain that trained bumblebees to access a sugar water reward by moving a ball into a specific location, essentially scoring a soccer goal. And the really fascinating thing that those researchers found is that those bumblebees learned that they'd get a reward faster if they watched another bumblebee do it first, or even if they watched a researcher with a fake bumblebee do it first. So there's quite a bit of skill there for learning. And the reason I'm talking about that with this slide is this is probably the most complex flower that we have here in the Pacific Northwest. And this is monkshood, Aconitum columbianum. And it usually takes more than a full minute for a bumblebee when first encountering this flower to learn how to gather the nectar. And once they visit more and more, that curve of learning begins to decrease and they become very efficient at it. But it's an extremely complex flower that pretty much no other insect can figure out how to retrieve the nectar from. Now, some carpenter bees can figure it out, but they can't do it the right way. So they actually bite into the nectar spur and avoid affecting pollination altogether. This is one of our most common bumblebees, particularly in the western half of Oregon. So this is Bombus vosnezinskii, or the yellow-faced bumblebee. And these are out right now, very likely in your home yards. I had a colony of these nesting in my yard last year. And we'll see these persisting into September at least. This is one of our rarest bumblebees. This is Bombus morrisoni, and this photo was the first record of this species in that location in about a century. So this is a fairly rare bumblebee, and it was actually considered to be potentially extirpated from Oregon or extinct in the state of Oregon only a few years ago. More focused efforts to look for it have found it in more locations, and this was not the only member of this species that I found at this location. So they actually seem to be doing okay. They're just not very common, but they're beautiful, beautiful bumblebees, really bright lemon yellow hair. And then we have some really, really weird bumblebees. So these are social parasites, and this is Bombus insularis. This is one of about 3 or 4 socially parasitic species that we have. These will wait until there's an established bumblebee nest, and then through a mixture of physical intimidation and pheromone manipulation, they will take over an existing nest and subdue a queen and force the existing workers to provide for her young. And so she doesn't produce any workers, she's just producing new males and new queens, or sort of queens. They're not exactly queens. So we have some really, really interesting social behaviors among some of the bumblebees, and these are obviously going to be at lower levels of abundance in the environment because they really need to find nests to take over. So a presence of some of these parasitic bumblebees is an indication that the bumblebee population is really robust in an area. And there's an image of that same species visiting a flower, nettle horseman. If you take a look, you can actually see some of the pollen floating away. So despite the fact that they don't collect pollen intentionally, they are still good pollinators. This is Halictus farinosus. So these are sweat bees. We have a lot of sweat bees throughout Oregon. They're pretty abundant. In fact, they tend to be some of our most abundant bees. Halictus legatus is another really common one that we see specifically in urban areas, the Western Cascades. These are facultatively social. They tend to be social, but in areas where they can't establish a nest, where the season's too short, so high elevations, 8,000 feet in the mountains, they'll go back to being solitary, but they tend to be social. So they produce workers. There's a dominant female, sort of a queen, but not quite a queen, because those workers are actually still reproductively viable. They usually don't reproduce their own offspring, but that's solely based on really intimidation from that dominant female rather than the capacity to. So bumblebee workers can't reproduce at all. Sweat bee workers can. Then we have in the same family, the metallic green sweat bees. Now we're getting out of our social species. We've completely left our native social species. But this group, the agapostomon, are at least communal. So they'll build communal nests where many females share a nest entrance at least, and then go off and build their nests out of the side of that entrance. They're really gorgeous bees, and they're actually pretty abundant. There's a male, and you can see why it's called agapostomon femeratus. These really weird swollen femora. And then we have parasites of these genera too. So the Sphecodes, which are known as the blood bees, are parasitic on a lot of sweat bees and some other bees. The Sphecodes are fascinating in that they range from really, really small bees. This one pictured here is about 5 millimeters to some bees that range to well over a centimeter. So they're parasitizing different bees, and their size is matching that. The majority of these have a bright red abdomen, and you'll notice as we look at some other parasitic species that that's kind of a shared trait, and we'll talk about that at some point in the future. So there's one out in the wild. Then a really huge group we have in Oregon are the mining bees in the genus Andrena. So they're extremely variable, where we have some metallic species that look somewhat like the mason bees we'll see a bit later on, and we have a lot of really dull species. There are probably over 100 species in Oregon. So they make up a really large part of our fauna. The vast majority of them are spring bees, so they come out anywhere from February through about now. Some will persist into the fall, and of course all of that is elevation dependent. So if you go up into the mountains in the summer, it's essentially spring there, and you're going to find these again. Because they're spring bees, they overwinter as adults. So they go through all their larval stages by the fall, and then overwinter as adults, just waiting for those specific environmental cues that will send them out into the environment. They are distinguishable, sometimes even in the field, by these patches of hair along the inside of the eyes known as fovea. And a lot of them are specialists. So they specialize on a couple species of flowers or a family. So here in Eugene, Oregon, and I first discovered this at Mount Pisgah Arboretum where I work, we have a species, Andrena anisiclora, that visits almost exclusively candy flower or Claytonia sibirica. And this is a really understudied species, but if you look at any of the handful of records of it throughout its range, it's specializing on related species of plants. So only visiting other plants in the family Montiaceae or the miner's lettuce family. And when you find these in a habitat with a lot of candy flower, you can find them by the tens of thousands. And here's what the male looks like. This is kind of an extreme example of sexual selection where the male has just massively enlarged mandibles. And that's probably partly to show both his health and also to grip the female during mating. It's another example of a specialist mining bee. This is Andrena caerulea, and it specializes on buttercups in the genus Ranunculus. So again, where you have large populations of buttercups, this bee can be extremely abundant. And then we have kind of our supreme generalist. This is Andrena nigrocaerulea, the beautiful black and blue bee, a little bit metallic. And I find this everywhere from the sea, from sea level up to over 9,000 feet on Steens Mountain in southeastern Oregon. So it visits all kinds of different flowers. It's a really abundant bee and a really, really pretty bee. And then their parasites tend to be bees in the genus Nomada. So these are nomad cuckoo bees. And here we start to see that red popping up again. And again, there's quite a bit of red here. Just as a brief aside, I think I have time for it. These little things hanging out behind the mid leg on this bee are a different type of kleptoparasite. These are the larvae of blister beetles. And blister beetles will ride bees. They'll wait on flowers to jump onto a bee's back and then ride them back to a nest and develop in that nest on the pollen that the bee has provisioned and kill the bees in there. So sometimes you have really large outbreaks of blister beetles and you'll just find them all over bees. And it's not a bad thing. It's just really helps regulate bee populations because they tend to target the most abundant species. So by targeting the most abundant species, you're allowing some niches to open up for some of the less abundant species. So it's really just a way of providing balance in bee populations. And here's the last picture of a nomada that I'll show, and this is one I'll take the opportunity to talk about that color red. So bees can't see the color red. It tends to just sort of blend into the background. It's kind of like a gray. And so the idea here is because these bees are parasites and they're sneaking into the nests of other bees, by being red, they might just blend into the background and be able to sneak in. So not only are they red to kind of disappear, but all of the kleptoparasites are also super heavily armored. So their exoskeleton is way thicker than on an average bee, and that's because they often do get caught and get into fights with the mother bee that's provisioning that nest. All right, now we'll move back to a completely different family. So this is the family Colletes, and this is a bee in the genus Colletes, and these are known as the plaster bees or polyester bees. And the reason for that name is that they line their nest cells, they nest in the ground, they line their cells with a polyester material that they secrete. And they have interesting modifications to facilitate that. So these bees are readily recognizable if they stick out their tongue because they have a bilobed tongue. You can see that here, and that's really unique among them. And that's to smooth out that polyester secretion along the inside of the nest cell. Here's a male of Colletes concadii here in the Willamette Valley. This is the species that we see most commonly, even though it's not commonly recorded here. When you find a population of it, they tend to be quite abundant, and they're out from late May into about now. They should start kind of falling off soon. Same family. These are the masked bees, which we talked about before briefly. And they're called that because the vast majority of them have these yellow masks on the face. So they're pretty easy to recognize, but they also look a lot like wasps. And initially it was believed that these were the proto-bees. These were essentially what the first bees looked like, and possibly these were really just the still extant ancestors of all the bees. The interesting thing is now with DNA analysis, researchers have found that these are actually one of the most recently evolved bees. So they've just kind of gone back to taking a wasp-like form. And part of that interesting wasp-like form is they don't carry pollen on their body. Like some of the other wasps, they carry pollen in a crop internally. So now we're jumping back into the family Apidae, and this is the family that includes the bumblebees and the honeybees. But these are going to be the solitary species. So these are species that build their own nests. And these bees in the genus Anthophora are collectively referred to as digger bees. So they tend to dig nests in the ground. I had a hard time fitting this bee on the screen because it has such an immensely long tongue. And that's fairly characteristic of most of the family Apidae. So this is a male, Anthophora urbana, and this is a female, and she's visiting penstemon. And then this is a different species, Anthophora terminalis, and you can see that some of them actually look quite a bit like bumblebees. There's some species that really mimic bumblebees and can trick you not only from a distance but up close until you start to take a look at some of their structures. Now we'll jump into the longhorn bees. So these are starting to come out right now, and they'll persist through September. The males of these longhorn bees are often some of the last bees that I find in the year hanging out on, sunflowers in October. These are known as the longhorn bees. The females have regular sized antennae, so you can see here, but the males have super exaggerated long antennae, hence the name longhorn bees. So these are quite recognizable. We have another group of longhorn bees in the genus Ucera that's widespread throughout Oregon, but they're really only out in the spring from February through mid-June. And right around that mid-June point, we hit a switch and we start getting this group, the genus Melisodes. So there's a little bit of overlap between the two, but if you find a longhorn bee in the middle of summer on your sunflowers, it's going to be Melisodes. Closely related, or fairly closely related to that group, are the Diadasia. And this is a really interesting group of bees. We have a couple dozen or so species in North America, and they're all specialists. A lot of them are specialists on mallows in the genus or the family Malvaceae. So in our area, they're specialists on checker mallows in genus Sidalcia, or glow mallows, the Spiralcia. And whenever you find good populations, particularly of glow mallows, you will find Diadasia. Here's an example of that same species out and about. So this is Diadasia diminuta, and it is a specialist on mallows. Some related bees in the genus Diadasia are specialists on cactus pollen. So we don't have those in Oregon, or if we do, only in the Hell's Canyon area where you get into some cactus again. But the interesting similarity between these two is that they're kind of specializing on plants that just have really large pollen grains. Both the mallows and the cactus don't produce pollen grains that have very much protein, so it's not a great food for your developing larvae, but they're super large, so they are a better fit for the hares, the pollen collecting hares of this genus. All right, now jumping into our final family, this is the Megachile, which includes the leafcutters and the mason bees. And first group is the Megachile, and those are the leaf cutters. And you can see they have evolved mandibles that are really well built for cutting leaves. So we have a lot of teeth here, and then we have razor sharp cutting interspaces between the teeth. So if you see holes cut out of leaves in your yard, it's probably these doing it. In my yard, they particularly like to use plants in the rose family. And here's a male. So the males look fairly similar. Some males, and this one in particular, have extremely enlarged foretarsi, or the front part of their 4 feet. You can see that here. So their segments are enlarged, and then there's a fringe of hairs. And this is used specifically to cover the female's eyes during mating. And the idea behind this is it's probably a mate recognition thing. So the exact shape and the amount of light that's being let through allows the female to recognize that it's a male of her own species that is attempting to mate with her. These males often tend to be territorial, so they'll set up a territory around a patch of flowers and patrol that, kicking out and attacking other male bees and just any other bees really that aren't in their species. And by doing so, they maintain the nectar and pollen for potential female mates. Their parasites are super cool. The genus Coleoxis. They're very, very distinctive looking. They have this really, really long, tapered, and sharply tipped abdomen. So if you see a bee like that, it's definitely a Coleoxis. These are a semi-common parasite. So anywhere, if you put up bee houses in your backyard for mason bees and leafcutter bees, and you have a lot of leafcutter bees, eventually you're probably going to see a few of these in your backyard checking out those nests. There's what the male looks like. So they look a lot like the leafcutter bees, and they're very closely related, but obviously have evolved quite a different lifestyle. Now into the mason bees. So the mason bees are another large group in Oregon. We have anywhere from 60 to 80, maybe even a few more species. That remains to be determined. This is Osmia aglaia, which is one of our, maybe a dozen or so really brightly metallic blue-green bees. And then some of the mason bees can be quite a bit darker, but they're all metallic, and that really kind of separates them pretty well from most of the other bees in their family. Now, we largely know mason bees, and their name is derived from the fact that they tend to collect mud to build their nests. So anywhere there's a really good patch of mud, you'll find bees digging in. And they're actually pretty picky about the mud they'll use. So when there's a good patch of mud, you can see mason bees coming from, within 100 yards or so to gather mud there. And some of these mud sources are perennial. So this is a spot on Steens Mountain where I see the same species of mason bees collecting mud from the exact same spot every year. But despite their name, the vast majority of mason bees in the genus Osmia don't actually collect mud. They chew up leaves like the leaf cutters, but rather than cutting nice sections of the leaves, they tend to masticate the leaf and almost make a mud out of it that they line their nest cells with. So this is Osmia montana, a really distinctive mason bee that we have. And you can see it has mandibles sort of like the leaf cutters that are really built for cutting leaves. And then we have one of my favorite groups, the Anthidiums. These are the wool carder bees. And we have a non-native species, Anthidium monocotum, that was introduced, I think it first showed up in California about 15 years ago. It's made its way all over the country. It's really abundant here in the Willamette Valley right now, and they are out right now. So the native species, particularly in the Willamette Valley, are really uncommon. I found this species, Anthidium utahensi, at Mount Pisgah Arboretum, and that was the first record of the species in the Willamette Valley in almost 100 years. They're all, almost all, marked quite a bit with pale markings on the abdomen. So they stand out. And males, a lot of what you utilize to identify them are these projections on their last abdominal segment. So they all look a bit different, and that's a good chunk of what you use to identify them. And then why they're called wool carder bees is the females have these usually 6 or more toothed mandibles, really sharp tooths, and they card plant fibers. So they use those to essentially shave off plant fibers, and that's what they build their nests with. And then we have some parasitic Anthidians in the genus Stelis. And they look quite a bit like a lot of the Anthidiums, and parasitize some of them. Really beautiful bees. Some of them are pretty similar looking to some of our mason bees. And then we have the group Hoplitis. And this is a pretty neat group. We have a dozen or so species in Oregon. And Oregon has some of the oddest species in the sense that only 3 of them are this vibrant metallic blue-green, and we have all 3 of them. So this is Hoplitis fulgida. This is a male of that same species. Really, really gorgeous bees. And then we have Hoplitis lewisii, which is one of the weirdest looking bees I think we have. It has these bizarre modified antennae. And modifications to the antennae are actually fairly common in the males of the genus Hoplitis. Here's an example of that again, where we have antennae that are hooked on the last segment. This is Hoplitis plagiostoma, and it's a very small bee, and they're specialists on popcorn flowers in the genus Plagiobothris and Cryptantha too, I believe. So usually very small flowers. The females have these specialized hooked hairs on their faces to collect the pollen from those small flowers. And you can see, again, a lot of these are really small. This is me holding a Hoplitis producta male that I found in my backyard between my fingers. So we're talking about 3 millimeters here. So that kind of wraps that up. So just as a final point, a lot of people wonder how bees are doing. And it's really difficult to generalize across 4,000 species in North America, right? And it's difficult to know for sure in all but the best studied species. So the best studied species tend to be the bumblebees. But we're merely scratching the surface and understanding the population dynamics of bee species and bee communities. And part of that is because so many of them are rarely found. There aren't a lot of people surveying for them. There aren't hardly any long-term surveys that look at populations longitudinally because we see just naturally big ups and downs in the populations of certain species year to year, and that's normal. And so if you're only surveying for bees 1 out of every 5 years, you're going to pick up what look like declines that aren't actually population declines in the broadest sense, in the sense that you would start worrying about them from a conservation perspective. An example of that is this pair of bees right here. These are bees in the genus Cleodora. And, uh-oh, my screen sharing's paused. Okay, sorry about that. I think that was on my end. So these are bees in the genus Cleodora facilii. This photo here is only the 2nd time they were recorded in Oregon. So of course you wouldn't be able to really tell the health of this population in Oregon if there are only 2 records. So when and where bees are declining, when we have enough data to see that, it can also be difficult to determine the causative factors. So there's a lot of work to be done to better inventory our bee species, just to even know what is here in Oregon. And again, the Oregon Bee Atlas is working on that. And then after that's done, kind of need to know how the bees are doing over long periods of time. Are their populations stable? Are they decreasing? obviously we have fewer bees than we did 200 years ago because the environment has changed so drastically. We have so many more monoculture farms, we have so many more parking lots, and our public lands are being cared for in a very different way. So despite the fact that it's really difficult to know right now how bees are doing, we can assume that some of them probably are not doing very well. And while we need science-based conservation to address those bees as individual species, for example, you wouldn't look to boost the, to make sure that there are greater insect populations in the Midwest to support a fish-eating species of bird, right? So bees are just as diverse, and you need to address them as species if you're looking to conserve them. However, there are things that we can be doing. A big part of that is planting native plants in your yard, ones that can provide resources from March through September, so really kind of covering the whole span of the bee season. So it's important to recognize that a lot of bee species are only above ground flying as adults for 2 to 3 weeks out of the year. That's about the adult lifespan once they enter out into the world. Some of those are going to be out in February. A completely different group is going to be out in late August. So it's important to provide resources for them if you can during that whole time period. And then we need to conserve public lands and strengthen partnerships on private lands with landowners that are looking to engage in conservation. We need to fight for better management of public lands, and part of that is rethinking our relationship to fire. So a lot of studies are showing that bees are really reliant on fire, and that this fire suppression that has happened across Western North America is really having an impact on bee populations. And the reason for that is fire kind of resets things. So normal fire regimes are going to either do a major reset in the coast range forests where you might have a fire every 500 to 1,000 years, or they're going to do these kind of decadal resets, potentially, like in the ponderosa pine forests of the high desert. All of that brings back flowering plants, and particularly annuals that are outcompeted often by perennial plants, shrubs, and trees. And bees really rely on those. We have a lot of bees that are specialists on annual plants. So after 15, 20 years without a fire, you might see that bee disappear from that location. So fire is really important, and engaging indigenous communities in restoring traditional ecological uses of fire is really important moving forward. And with that, that's it. And hopefully I didn't overdo my time. So I will stop my screen share now. All right.
Thank you so much, August. That was awesome. And as soon as I make sure that you all can see my screen. So thank you again. And for folks who maybe joined a little late, I'm Chandra Legui with Oregon Wild, and I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about Oregon Wild's work and how it pertains to bees before we get to your really great questions. There's so many great questions that came in. So we might go 5-10 minutes past 7 o'clock to get to some of those. So I just want to note that especially to your last points, August, about how important it is to consider how we manage our public lands. That's exactly where groups like Oregon Wild come in. Our main campaigns include protecting special places across the state, like our last intact wild areas, defending and restoring Oregon's forests and waters, which have been degraded in many places by years of logging and fire suppression, as you noted. And then also we work to help native species thrive through policies and habitat protection and restoration. And so all of that work benefits bees and other native pollinators. And I, for one, absolutely love native pollinators. So my pictures are not nearly as good as yours. and we did have some questions about whether you took those pictures. And I believe you did take all or most of those pictures, right? They are stunning. But I love to take pictures whenever I get out hiking and observing bees out there in all of the various habitats that I enjoy. So I think one of these is a native bumblebee and the other one might be a honeybee, but I just think they're fascinating. Here's a couple more that aren't bees, but just to show you that I truly am a nature nerd. I love seeing these guys do their work, whether it's a fly or butterfly or moth or beetle or bee. So they are awesome. And I guess what it comes down to really is, from Oregon Wild's perspective, is that native bees and other pollinators need native habitats. And those habitats range from old growth forests that have flowering shrubs and small openings to mountain meadows and wetlands like this one that are filled with wildflowers, to coastal bluffs and desert sagebrush. So there's a lot of diversity of habitats out there to support our native bees. And of course, that relationship also goes both ways. Without bees, we wouldn't have these beautiful landscapes and the diverse vegetation that we all love to look at or experience in other ways either. So you mentioned fire, which is awesome, because I was gonna have to go on a little diatribe about fire, but yeah, fire is so important to creating bee habitat and is certainly a natural part of our landscapes across Oregon. Fires help create these structures like standing dead trees and down logs that bees find cavities to nest in. They create openings for all those nectar plants. But even in areas that haven't burned for a really long time, in our old growth forests, you get things like snags and down logs and little openings like this one here, where bees can find all sorts of great places to call home. Of course, what's sad and nearly universal across a lot of Western Oregon, especially, is that these habitats have been disturbed by human management. From roads to grazing to fire suppression to logging, or even worse, logging after a fire to remove all of those great structures and harm the soil. So that all leads to a loss of habitat and a lot less diversity of habitat to support our native pollinators. Out in a clear cut like this, or in a young plantation that's a monoculture, you don't have any of those structures that they can nest in, or much diversity of plants that they can collect pollen from. In fact, standard practice on timber plantations and clear cuts is to spray herbicides, which kills all of our native plants, other than the trees that they're trying to grow. So just to reiterate, where the best bee habitat is found, certainly yes, in our backyards and around homes where we use natural pesticide-free landscaping and have native plants. But out in the wild and wild landscapes, we mostly find it on public lands, on particular federal public lands that Oregon Wild works to protect and to restore. So if we can retain our remaining ancient forests and wild lands and all of those habitats they support, then we're going to retain our native bees. And they can continue doing the amazing services that they do for all of us, and have their rightful place in the ecosystem. So thank you, all of you out there, for supporting Oregon Wild and the work that we do around that. So as I said, we have a lot of questions. So I'm going to, I was collecting a bunch, and then a bunch have come in as I've been talking. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen actually, and get to just me and August, and see if I can't suss some of these out. So actually, I'm going to start with some good ones that came in early on. You talked about the different groups of bees, and you did end up describing some of them, like why a mason bee or a leafcutter bee group got its name. But what about bumblebee or sweat bees? What gives those groups their name?
Bumblebees, I think it's just their tendency to be a little bit awkward in flying sometimes, particularly the queens. They kind of bumble around. There's some species in particular that, the really large ones, they tend to really try not to fly too much between flower to flower, so you'll see them just kind of falling over flowers. That's where they got their name, I think. The sweat bees, they're, for whatever reason, there was an idea that they were more likely to land on you to lick up sweats because, bees require salts, and sometimes they get it from the environment by feeding it mud puddles like butterflies do. I've had some bees land on me to lick sweat, but never a sweat bee, so I don't know how accurate the name is. But that's how they got their name. And then some of the others, there aren't really good common names for a lot of the bees, but the mason bees kind of describes their nesting habitats, and the digger bees and miner bees. So those are more descriptive in terms of actually talking about what they're doing.
Got it. We had a couple of specific questions around some of the really beautiful neon green and neon blue bees and where they might live. I think probably people looking to seek those out. Anywhere. The Western Cascades right now, and some of the high elevation meadows, you'll find some of those really bright green mason bees. The metallic green sweat bees in the genus Agapostomon are pretty common to really common in urban areas. And, I see males really crowding the sunflowers in my yard in late August, September. And then, kind of across the state, just if you're looking, plants that seem to bring in some of those mason bees and the Hoplitis, the metallic green Hoplitis, are Phacelia or scorpion weeds. So if you can find places that have a lot of Phacelia, which, at 4,000, 5,000 feet is blooming right now, you'll find some after a little bit. You just have to keep your eyes open. They're small,
yeah,
and
some of them are very small.
You can't really see them when you're, I don't know, just walking quickly or mountain biking or something like that. Yeah. I have a couple of questions about honeybees. I asked one of them, why didn't you talk about them? And I said they're not native. But if you maybe wanted to make a comment or two about honeybees, and maybe whether the honeybee industry has had an impact on native bees, if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah. So this is a complex topic because the honeybees are non-native. They're brought in from Europe to do pollination and for their honey. So one of the really great products that we get from honeybees that we don't and can't really get from our other native bees is honey and beeswax. So honeybees are really awesome for that. The really funny thing is that for a lot of the crops that they're used for, they're not as good at pollination as our native bees. So we kind of developed this weird industry where we're relying on one animal to provide this service that, one, already existed, and two, puts agriculture in a more precarious position. It's another kind of industrial input. So we've really industrialized honeybees. And what's problematic about that is that we're now trucking honeybees across the country to go to California to do almond pollination. And within the last couple decades, where they would generally go back to in the Midwest has transformed into corn and soy fields. So where it used to be kind of a mix of crops that actually did have flowers and provided nectar and honey, now the honeybees don't have anywhere to go, so they're being trucked in some cases to national forest land, where they're competing with wild bees. And Dr. Jim Kane out of, with the USDA, wrote a paper recently looking at honeybee competition with native bees, and found that one of this truckloads of honeybees in a national forest uses enough resources to potentially displace up to 4 million native bees. And that's kind of just a look at how much nectar and pollen they're gathering. That's so it's just kind of quantifying those things rather than actually measuring that displacement in the field, which would be really hard. But what that shows is that they can have a really massive effect on native bee populations. They can also spread diseases to native bee populations. So honeybees are never not going to be part of our agriculture. and they're wonderful too. Both as kind of just they're beautiful insects, beautiful creatures, and the honey and beeswax is phenomenal and like a really sustainable source of sugar and of everything you can do with beeswax, which is a lot. But we need to be a little more wary of how much we're relying on them.
Got it. Yeah, very complex. You already mentioned some of the things that we should be doing or could be doing to help native bees, like in our own yards. And someone weighed in saying that they work with a group in the San Francisco area to develop pollinator patches and gardens in the rural and urban settings. And wondering if you know of groups doing that work in Oregon that maybe folks listening can support.
It depends. I mean, so the Oregon project out of Oregon State University has provided resources in terms of materials for kind of doing that on your own. I know the Xerces Society works with particularly farms to install some native hedgerows. Super locally, I'm not aware of any organizations that are sort of working to provide the funding and resources and knowledge to help out with that. But I know that organizations are doing that in different ways kind of throughout the state and really throughout the country. So.
Great. I had a couple of questions come in about, you mentioned a bee that makes, I think the Colletes bees that make polyester. Yeah. And how possible and where do they secrete it from?
So there's a gland that they secrete it from kind of near the, if I'm remembering right, near the tip of the abdomen. And so they're just secreting what is, a polyester. And then, it's really a thin film. So they're small insects, they're not secreting much. And then they're spreading that out, and that's waterproofing. Of course, it's super durable too in terms of keeping out soil fungi that could potentially infect the pollen masses that are stored in there. But they're pretty unique in that a lot of other bees do that.
Okay, and to wrap up, maybe I have a couple questions about timing. So one is what's out there for native bees to eat in February for early spring bees, and then sort of on the other end of things, how late are mason bees out in the fall?
Yeah, good question. So what's blooming that's native in February tends to be, at least in Western Oregon, the Willamette Valley, oso berries or Indian plum, and Oregon grape. So our state flower, tall Oregon grape, is one of the first bloomers, and both of those are really crucial for a lot of the early pollinating fauna, including flies too, which come out a little bit before the bees. And then mason bees tend to stretch. They're another bee that overwinters as an adult and is waiting for the right environmental cues. So they're one of the earliest, and depending on the year, depending on how warm things get, that can be February, and then they're usually wrapped up by July. And again, this is at kind of Willamette Valley, valley floor elevations. You go higher up and it's spring again. But if you're looking to house mason bees in your yard, March generally through July is good. And the July is really some of these, just a handful of lagging species that are quite a bit later than most of the other mason bees. But those are the ones, for whatever reason, that I have really abundantly in my yard. So it's busy right now. It wasn't a month ago.
Cool. Well, this was great timing, August, which apparently it's pollinator week, so it's a great time to celebrate all of our pollinators. And I know you're doing another presentation with the toxics tomorrow, I believe.
That's right. Yeah, 10 a.m.
So folks can check that out. And yeah, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you, August, for sharing your amazing knowledge and great pictures. And remember to tune in next week for the webcast about the Snake River for those who are interested. So thank you all so much.
Thanks for having me, and thank you all for being here.
All right.